Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name's Jamie Schrant. I am a community relations manager here at Rogers Behavioral Health. Joining me today is Dr. Kristin Miles and Dr. Jean Yang. They are going to explore the effects of bullying and the interventions to consider implementing. And just before we get started, I do have a few logistics I need to go over with all of you. This webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes, and to receive CE credits, you must be logged into the webinar for the entire program. Your attendance will be tracked via the Zoom login and logout records. A PDF of the PowerPoint slides and a list of the references will be available immediately after the program via an email with a link to your personal dashboard on ce-go.com. In addition, a recording of the webinar will be published on Rogers' YouTube channel. It will be published there within the next day or two, so you can rewatch it if you would like. Our speaker will give a 70 to 75-minute presentation. Following that presentation today, I will facilitate a Q&A session. If you would like to ask our speaker a question, we ask you to please use the Q&A button, not the chat button, to send us a message. That Q&A button is located at the bottom of your screen. You can simply click on it, and it's right, again, it's a button on your Zoom taskbar. I will review the question that you submitted, then the presenters will address those questions during the Q&A portion of our webinar time today. Finally, we have enabled closed captioning for this program. At the bottom of your screen, there is a live transcription button. From that menu, you can click Show Subtitles to view the audio as text. If you'd like to disable the subtitles, simply click Hide Subtitles from the live transcription menu. But now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to the stars of our program here, Dr. Kristin Miles and Dr. Jean Yang. Thank you.
It helps if I unmute. Thank you very much. Welcome. We're glad to have you with us today to talk about this topic. The title obviously identifies, like, why are we even still talking about that? And we'll certainly address that as we go. These are our disclosures. Basically, we don't have anything we need to disclose during this presentation. And then our learning objectives for you for joining us today. So within this webinar, we're going to take a closer look at bullying and why does it happen and what do we do about it being the important pieces. The evolution of bullying and the pharmacological interventions that can take place as well. And then, as she mentioned, at the end, we'll have time for questions. These are our subjectivities as we have been able to share with you what we bring to the table. All right, let's begin. So a closer look at bullying. Why does it happen and what do we do about it? Let's start with the definitions of bullying. We'll begin with Dr. Dan Olveus, who is a Swedish-Norwegian professor who has devoted his career to learning about and then educating others on bullying, its effects and interventions. So he starts with a relatively simple definition that has grown over the years in a variety of ways. And you see two other options here that have become more and more involved with what is included in how you might actually define bullying. It also evolves with time with regard to including online experiences. One important note is on the very last definition here, the very end of it, it identifies that single incidents and conflict or fights between equals, whether in person or online, are not defined as bullying. And so that's important to be aware of when you're really considering whether or not someone is struggling with bullying experiences. What is also important here is the definition of bullying. There are three threads that flow throughout it. Having power or needing power, it's repetitive in nature, and it causes intentional harm on the victim. So why are we still talking about this? The answer to that is that the data is telling us it's still existing in numbers still of concern. And so you can see here, there are some statistics that the most recent CDC Youth Risk Behavior Survey has found with our youth and how much bullying students are at least reporting that they're experiencing. An important note here is that these numbers actually might not be accurate, because the risk of reporting bullying for a victim who is still in the experience of bullying might stop them from actually sharing the information with others. So it is entirely possible that these numbers in reality are much higher than what we're actually seeing and what they're willing to report at this point in time. Because bullying has been an issue for a long time, legislations have stepped in and said, we need to do something about this. School districts have stepped in and said, we need to do something about this. And this started long ago, where they started to mandate this. The problem is that there was a tendency to put anything in place, and typically it was not based in research. It was often a quick fix or a magic wand attempt, but typically those tended to fail. And we'll talk more about that as we get further along. One important note is that our future teachers, and really our current teachers, need to be willing to learn about bullying and be motivated to do what it takes to minimize it in the school setting, as well as within family and community settings. So this is where you as clinicians come in. More and more, the field of psychology is being asked to help with getting school programs, policies, and initiatives running. These are all with the intention of creating a safe and healthy environment for our kids to learn in. In order to do that, we must better understand the underlying causes and the interventions that have been found to be most effective. Let's meet three 13-year-olds who are in 7th grade. You should know before I begin this that this is set in October of 2020, and that might be important as you consider the factors here. We'll start in the middle with Ming. Ming is an Asian American trans male. Their given name was May, but they chose Ming. They use they, them pronouns. Their parents are first-generation Americans and hold strong Chinese values. They have one younger brother who's in 4th grade. You also should know that Ming is new to this school, has had some difficulty making friends, tend to sit by themselves and read, but not engage with others. They are fairly intellectual, but often get teased for this, and have gotten lots of bullying in the form of comments about the, quote, Chinese virus, getting called names and told to go back to where they came from. The bullying tends to happen from one particular social group, and no one tends to step in. Let's move over to Mike. Mike is a white cisgender male. He uses he, him pronouns. He has had some recent experience in which his parents have become divorced. Mom is working more, so he's seeing less of her. Dad just doesn't come around as often, and he spends a lot of time with his grandparents. It's also important to know that these grandparents and the whole family tend to hold a strong patriarchal view, with the exception of one aunt. That aunt tries to speak up and say things, but often gets silenced by the family and overpowered by them with their views. He does have 2 siblings, one older and one younger, and he is part of the social group that picks on Ming. He has actually begun to experience popularity within the school due to his talents in sports, and he's emerging as a leader of the social group that he is in. Octavius is our last 13-year-old I want to talk about. He is biracial, but we don't know what that mixture is, and that's on purpose because he doesn't care to share that very often. It's not an area he wants to shed much light on or discuss. He's cisgender male, he, him pronouns. He was born with a congenital limb defect, which causes his left arm to be smaller than his right arm. His parents are married. He's an only child, and he has become the star player of the soccer team. He is also part of the same social group as Mike, and an interesting experience here is that Mike picks on Octavius, but does it a lot through joking, and Octavius just laughs in response, but it does bother him. He has chosen not to address it in any way for fear of what might happen to him with the group. He does not hold that same level of status as Mike does in the social group. The other important piece is Mike and Octavius have been with their same peers and each other since elementary school and are not new to this school. So at this point, I would ask you to just consider a few things. What would you want to do with any one of these individuals, or all of them if they came to you separately through referral or by their own choice? What would you want to do with them? What would you want the school or the teachers to know about them and how to help intervene with them? How might diversity and culture play a role in each individual as well as the collective interactions amongst them? How might these factors be considered when treating each individual person? And then what might societal factors that are happening in October of 2020 play a role in this bullying experience, both with them on an individual identity basis, but into the bigger zeitgeist of their family and of society? So these are things to think about as we go forward. So why is the bully bullying? Let's begin talking about developmental expectations and moral reasoning development. So if you take a look at this chart, it's pretty straightforward, things we tend to already know. But if we look at it in light of bullying, those younger ages, we're seeing a more simplified approach towards social experiences, and even the idea of reward and punishment, or what's right and wrong, tend to be pretty concrete. Friendships tend to be pretty fickle in that one day I could be best friends with someone, the next day I'm not, and the next day we're friends again. And things just don't have the same level of complexity. As you're getting older, you're seeing greater and greater complexity. And when we get to that 12 or 13 and older age range, there's really a lot more going on where they're trying to learn about and figure out their identity, their peer relationships, and from a moral reasoning perspective, navigate those experiences where maybe I don't agree with something they did, but I really still want to be their friend. And how do I manage that? Looking at more areas that affect the bullying behaviors, self-esteem has found in research to be an area of focus. If we identify, if a person identifies with a more authentic self-esteem, so that's the self-esteem that gets created out of experiences that provide them a sense of value and worth, and that value and worth is not contingent on items, which is that externally contingent self-esteem, there tends to be less risk of becoming a victim to bullying. And so we really want to foster that. If we look at age, in the middle school age range, which is about that 12 to 14, 11 to 14 age range, we're seeing a lot of stressors, a lot of transitions, as well as development changes within the individuals in this range. We talked a little bit about identity already, and that's a key time when they're trying on lots of different types of identities and trying to figure out where they fit in and who they fit in with. That can play a big role in whether someone ends up in that bullying role or victim role, or sometimes both. And then popularity and other goals also play a role in this, and they're actually pretty related to each other. So if a group of peers have a goal together and they have to work together to gain that goal, research is seeing that they tend to be more pro-social, they tend to be more supportive with each other, and you see less bullying and victimization in situations of that nature. However, if the goals that people have are more agenic or to each individual, and that goal is to win, they tend to be more competitive, more aggressive and coercive in nature with each other. And then that's the general goals. But then when we look at popularity, if there's this desire to be the most influential, interesting person, and it's done by stepping on the other people or silencing out other people, it is more likely that you're going to, again, get those more aggressive tendencies towards bullying. Think about that from the perspective of the Octavius and Mike interrelation that we were seeing in the three individuals we presented. And then finally, group dynamics, which is an important piece here as well. So there are several factors within group dynamics that can play a role in putting someone either in the bullying or victim role. And keep in mind that someone could also potentially be in both. So those factors include de-individuation, meaning that the group as a whole tends to be pretty homogenous. They're very similar. They have a lot of the same likes, the same interests, and they don't really go against each other. If that group as a whole is agreeable to the concept of bullying in order to get what you need, then we're going to see a lot more bullying and a lot more risk of harming other people. When you are a part of a group, if that out group threatens the group and the group is pretty homogenous, then we're more likely to see greater bullying behaviors. If there is someone in the group who does not agree with the rest of the group, that person is potentially at risk unless the group has a general acceptance for diversity and differences amongst the people in the group. A desire within the group status to move up can be dangerous as well, because if that is only attainable by pushing others down, you're more likely to see these bullying behaviors. And then anonymity is an important piece too, and that goes along with the de-individuation and a large-sized group. So if a person can bully another person without ever being held accountable or someone knowing that it is them that's doing it, they are more likely to engage in those behaviors. And then on top of that, you add on the complication of if the group is actually very supportive of bullying types of behaviors as opposed to anti-bullying approaches. And then certainly all of that plays into the online experience, which Dr. Yang will talk more about later. Vulnerable populations is a really important area to talk about too. These individuals can absolutely be at greater risk than the general population for becoming a victim of bullying. First, there are obviously many vulnerable populations, but these are the areas that I took a closer look at. And one of the findings with mental health diagnoses was if we look at the ED side, meaning eating disorder, we aren't necessarily suggesting that every person with an eating disorder diagnosis is the person at risk, but people who are struggling with their weight might actually become more at risk and more at risk for getting that eating disorder diagnosis. There's this very vicious cycle that occurs in which the person who is struggling with weight might get teased for their weight. Then they might do something about that or attempt to and continue to get teased for their weight. And if at some point that individual who is teasing them stops, it is now ingrained in their head and they're constantly hearing that even if the other person has stopped. And then they start more of these eating disorder type behaviors. And we get into this terrible cycle that is really difficult to break. Looking at ADHD and LD, we are finding that those diagnoses alone don't necessarily put you at risk for being a bully or a victim. But when you add anxiety on top of that, you actually increase the risk by 3.5 times. A lot of that has to do with the social communication and risk of or removal from social experiences where you might get some natural social cues that you would not otherwise get if you're getting bullied, and removing yourself from your peers. Autism spectrum disorder is an interesting area to look at as well. The research is finding very variable responses to this. So variable that it's like 6 to 46% are at risk of getting bullied compared to the general population. And they believe the reason for that is the varying levels in which a person could be on that actual spectrum. And so they may be at a point where they don't actually understand that they're being bullied because it's so subtle that it doesn't hit home for them. And so this is an area that I would encourage people to actually make sure that they're paying close attention to make sure that those on the autism spectrum are not getting taken advantage of. LGBTQ population is also at risk. The kind of bullying that can happen here is stigma-based or bias-based bullying. One of the interesting studies here that talked a lot about the use of bullying that is not overt, but much more covert. And so if we talk about a trans individual, so think of Ming, if someone is purposely using the pronouns that are not what they would prefer to use, that also can be considered bullying. Same thing with using their dead name. And when that becomes tricky is when the staff don't think of that as bullying, don't think of that as a problem. And so then there's less likely to be interventions on that. Similarly, of importance is that these individuals have a harder time with reporting things, because if they report it, then they have to identify themselves in ways that they might not be ready to actually identify themselves with other staff members or whoever might get involved. So that gets extra complicated. And then racial and ethnic minorities, the research here is also interesting because this also showed a wide variability of level of victimization. But the general finding is that if there was good representation of the minorities within the school setting or whatever setting we're talking about, there is less likelihood that they're going to have become a victim of bullying. Also, if there is a strong value within the community or the family on their ethnic identity, that tends to be a protective factor against bullying. So this is just a representation of different mental health diagnoses and bullying experiences. And you can see that it had increased over a year's time for most individuals. And then this is for the racial and ethnic perspective. It does show a decrease, but not a whole lot of a decrease over 10 years. And then gender. The tricky part with gender is the CDC did identify that they did have a binary choice, male or female here. And so they may have missed the mark on that as far as looking at something beyond binary. But one important note is that society as a whole still tends to hold this expectation of males versus females differently. And I think sometimes even without realizing that that's what we do, but males tend to be expected to be more assertive, independent, competitive, and aggressive, whereas women or females tend to be expected to be more affectionate, caring, and sensitive to the needs of others. And so we might actually accidentally be putting those genders in different bullying roles that might not actually be accurate. And so we have to keep that in mind. So effects on bullying. I'm going to keep this pretty short because the good news is the research identifies that not a lot has changed as far as there isn't new effects that we're finding that are different from what we found before. And keeping in mind that everyone has different levels of resiliency, some more than others, and the resiliency can really be affected by other things in their life, which is what you see under the considerations, trauma and social supports, as well as caregiver and teacher support and developmental experiences. So a quick overview of the effects of bullying, just kind of as a quick statement on this, is mood disturbances, so depression, anxiety, poorer social development, some non-suicidal self-injurious behaviors. Attention and focus get to be challenged because they're so focused on the bullying and what's about to happen next or how they're internally experiencing it that they can't focus on the other things they're supposed to be. Brain development is an interesting finding in that they're noticing that bullies actually are having greater executive functioning ability. And that's because they're having to get more and more careful and creative about how in which they're doing the bullying. So it becomes more subtle and they're actually using that part of the brain more and it strengthens it. And then suicide, which I think is a really important one to note because it is obviously the most dire. One important note about suicide is bullying in itself by itself doesn't necessarily cause suicide, but there are many other factors that we have to consider that an individual might be experiencing at the same time as that bullying, and those put together could put someone at much more serious risk for suicide. Okay, so what do we do about it? So the research identifies that there are essentially two levels if you look at it. One is the individual level and one is more of like the school or system level. Beginning at the individual level, we look at improving their distress tolerance and social skills, both in the bully and the victim. It's not uncommon that somewhere along the line that did not get focused on or strengthened within either individual. And so we do want to take more of a focus on how are they managing those things and what new or different techniques do we need to teach them. Increasing self-esteem, that's all over the research for sure. If a person is not feeling very good about themselves, they are much greater risk both for bullying and greater effects from the bullying. There is some findings that bullies themselves also struggle with self-esteem, and that may play a role in why they do some of the bullying, but that isn't necessarily always the go-to answer for the bully as to what is going on. And then empathy training. Empathy training is particularly important and gets mentioned in probably every single research article regarding bullying, because it's so important that we teach individuals to take another perspective, to really think about how someone else is going to feel. And when people are putting in interventions, they are putting a greater focus on the actual empathy training. Because if we understand how someone else feels and could potentially experience that ourselves, we may be less likely to actually put someone else in that position. These last two notes are highlighted because they would be more so at the school level of intervention consideration, but could also be at that individual level. So we want to ensure that individual goals and a reward system are considered in all of this. So when we're talking about goals, we want to understand, like, what is the goal really of the bully? What is it why are they doing what they are doing? And do we need to change how they attain that goal? Or do we actually need to change what their goal is? Because maybe their goal is actually quite inappropriate. So the goal could be to have power over everyone in this social group. But that might not really be a reasonable goal or even a good goal. And so we might have to change their belief system and their understanding of how to get what they need. Because maybe the real goal is not to have power over everybody, but to feel some sense of importance. And so then we change how they try and approach achieving that goal. The reward system piece is really important as well, because it is often that the bully's behavior is actually reinforced in one form or another, and it's not always obvious. So sometimes we have to dig pretty deep to try to find where that reinforcement is living. It may be the peer reactions that's reinforcing for them, but again, that goes back to the goal. What is their goal? Why is that reinforcing? And do we need to change that? And then that ties into something I'll talk about in just a little bit here and relates in relation to value and beliefs within the school system. So, and then the last piece there, monitoring school connectedness. Research is constantly finding that if a student feels connected to the school, they're much less likely to engage in these bullying behaviors, because typically those bullying behaviors are going to disconnect them from the school, and they don't want that. And so schools finding many different ways to try and engage their students, even if it's as simple as a student being important to the classroom because they hold a particular role or job that someone else doesn't. That could be a simple way of doing it. But then the more elaborate ways would be all the different committees and extracurriculars that a student could engage in that would connect them to the school and give them some sense of pride. If they have pride in the school, then they're more likely to actually engage in more pro-social behaviors. So moving on to the school interventions, which obviously I already started to talk about with those very same 2 points, really important in the school and classroom perspective is the beliefs and values that are upheld. So the research is finding that it's not uncommon for a school to put in place an anti-bullying system, but the teachers might not fully believe in that system, or the staff in general might not. And then they might actually be setting up a pro-bullying experience in the classroom because they're allowing certain things to happen rather than holding people accountable. Similarly, in relation to our vulnerable populations, it's really important that the school and the classroom, or the teacher specifically, holds acceptance and inclusion within their school and their classroom, because without that, the individuals who don't fall in the mainstream are going to feel empowered to step on those who are different, as well as to engage in those more bullying type of behaviors. There are 2 prevention programs that are listed on here. Grit training, which comes actually out of legitimate grit training. So can someone persevere through challenging situations, and how do they do that? And they found that if they actually trained students to focus on a goal that was not related to bullying, that their attention towards these individuals that they had previously been spending a lot of time focused on in a negative light decreased significantly, and provided them with some more very important skills in relation to achieving their goals. That has been found to be quite effective. And then the Olveus Bullying Prevention Program. I know several universities have this as a training program that they will offer to schools. And there are several aspects within this training that Dr. Olveus, out of all of his research, has found to be absolutely pertinent in rolling them out. There are 4 key principles: showing warmth and positive interest in the students, setting firm limits to unacceptable behaviors, using consistent, non-physical, non-hostile negative consequences when rules are broken, and functioning as authorities and positive role models within the school. He also found, as I mentioned before, if you only take part of it rather than doing the entire system, you are less likely to have success and be effective. But the schools that did do that have had significant decreases in bullying, especially over time. So some lessons learned. Based on the research, what have we learned does not work? Well, the cross-age friends or peer mentors is risky, because they found that sometimes what could happen is the older peer will find that the younger peer can become kind of their scapegoat, and they can kind of teach them how to do bullying in a more subtle way. And so that can really backfire within the school. Zero tolerance programs, or as mentioned before, cherry picking parts of a program out, have also been found to be very ineffective. The zero tolerance programs tends to put the onus on the child. We will not allow you to do this, but then not have anything to back it up. And also not teaching the skills that are needed to go forward. Waiting too long to intervene is definitely a problem, because you get into this chronic bullying victim cycle, and it becomes much more difficult to break into. And typically the victims are afraid to say anything or do anything, and so they're less likely to engage in any type of intervention. Staff and parent attitudes not aligning with the anti-bullying program. That is related to what I was talking about before with the school and the classroom. So if anyone is standing there and does not agree with this anti-bullying stance, then they are supporting the bullying experience. So staff engagement and confidence in engagement really does matter. And then relationships with the students is really important. We can't forget that if we have an experience with the student that is positive and they care about the people in the school, we are more likely to be able to affect change within these behaviors or not have them happen in the first place. Some general recommendations are to keep the interventions being developmentally appropriate, considering cognitive development and capacity, a need for personal autonomy, a need for peer approval and acceptance, general identity development, where are they on that trajectory, and considering family and school involvement and how can you obtain that. And then a quick note on workplace bullying. While that was not necessarily the focus of our talk today, I did look at some research and found it quite interesting that there's a lot of similarities between the workplace bullying and what we're talking about within school settings. And so they found that if you create a safety net in which there is a culture where people can bring things forward without concern about retaliation, and that they will actually be listened to, that is a big factor in improving the experience. Participatory change. meaning that in this case, employees, but otherwise students are part of the change. So they also need to be willing to not accept bullying as a common factor or experience. Team unity, so moving away from the us versus them, but more to a we, and again, where we actually care about each other and want to support each other. And then positive change trajectory. So creating the sense that change is possible, that we can do better, we can be in a more positive experience, and then reinforcing those positive experiences and positive attitudes as they happen. And then the last note I'd like to leave you with is that when you're addressing bullying behaviors, it's really important to look for the root cause of the behavior, not just the overt behavior alone, because without doing that, you're not going to make a lot of change. And at this point, I will turn it over to Dr. Yang.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Miles. So going to touch on sort of the evolution of bullying, especially the intersection between bullying and technology, as well as a quick note on some pharmacological interventions. If I can grab the next slide, please. So the evolution of bullying with technology is something that I think a lot of people are aware of, and just wanted to put it into context in terms of what we've already heard from Dr. Miles. I selected essentially picking a few different points in the timeline of internet technology and app development. So initially, when we think back to 2003, when MySpace came up, the reason why this is important is these are outward facing, meaning that someone actually puts personal information up. And generally speaking, it's difficult to control who views that information. And it also allows for interaction with people who you wouldn't normally be able to get in touch with. Depending on the age range of the audience, some people might be like, oh, I do remember creating my MySpace account. And then Facebook then came up, and then Twitter then increased the range at which people could connect and distribute information. I consider the iPhone to be sort of a bellwether and a hallmark of a change in the dynamics of how we engage with other people online. Previously, all of the other websites required you to be at a computer. And then the iPhone first developed this idea of a computer in hand. There are other previous iterations of that, like Windows Mobile and the BlackBerry, but nothing like the iPhone that created this new paradigm. And if I can grab the next slide, please. And once you have the dawn of the app after the iPhone, after which Google then launched their ecosystem, as well as a couple other corporations, you have some of the most popular apps in the world that are used worldwide. You have Snapchat, which can be outward facing, meaning that you don't necessarily have to have any filters on who can view what you're posting. Discord, which is a chat app, as well as TikTok, that is currently in the news quite a bit lately, and that's a video sharing app. Obviously, and I feel like this is sort of obvious, but want to have the data to support it, that there are high rates of use among teens for all of these social media applications and mobile applications. The important part of any of these apps is the expanded access to be able to bully as well as to be bullied. Previously, bullying was limited geographically, but also within age ranges. So bullying would happen like at the middle school, between middle school kids at that middle school. Right, or bullying would happen in high school. Now it could be someone in Germany bullying someone in the United States, and more often, as we're seeing, it can be adults actually bullying children. So the previous geographic limitations that prevented some access has been increasingly disappearing. And just to touch on that de-individuation that was mentioned before by Dr. Miles, the internet can make you just this anonymous thing where it's easier to jump on a bandwagon, say something hurtful because the consequences are less apparent to you. And then the next slide, please. This is another set of information. This is from the Pew Research Center, so different from the CDC, but it sort of highlights just the technological impact of certain aspects of bullying. So when we're talking about cyberbullying specifically, which is the use of technology in bullying, it says almost half of teens have experienced it. Similar to Dr. Miles's caveat before with regard to any of these surveys is that, we're expecting a decreased report, often because either people downplay it or sometimes they really don't even notice. It's sort of part of the normal dialogue of the day-to-day life, which we don't want to have as normal. This is nice because it does break it down between other categories, not just to include boys and girls, but age ranges as well as races. Of note, and I think this is sort of a really important part, is taking a look at the spreading of false rumors that tends to be pretty high. Just pointing that one out because essentially it's very clever, right? It's social sabotage. So even though there's no physical harm, no one's being punched or anything like that, it can cause a huge impact on self-esteem, and often more importantly, it really can destroy social support networks. So it's not just designed to make you feel badly about yourself, which is when we think of bullying sort of in the traditional context, but it also is an attempt to remove any support that you might have, right? So remove any people that you might normally go to. So a little bit more, yeah. When we talk about those interventions, especially saying that we don't want to focus and sort of cherry pick just the offensive parts, then you're talking about, how can we sort of nip it in the bud? Really, it goes back to what Dr. Miles was saying, sort of increasing empathy, and then creating an environment at baseline that doesn't promote bullying. On the other hand, people love to have interventions for, each of these offensive things that are being noticed. So usually we break it down into two sides, like what can parents do and then what can institutions do. So lots of ways in terms of like parental technology interventions. Of note, kids are clever. So these obviously not endorsed by us, but often recommended, and parents often give feedback that, these systems work well, often cost money, which is also a barrier, but they tend to be more in-depth. So some of them, sort of like Bark and Fence.ai, really are granular control systems so that kids find them difficult to bypass, versus Life 360 is more of a voluntary thing where the kids just choose to also participate, and that, making sure that parents know where they are. There's different use cases. So and then this often comes with the question of like, what is the best time for a kid to get a mobile phone or a mobile application device? And that the answer really is a parenting decision. And then to help guide in terms of like how they might want to deploy it and when. A lot of focus has been spent on sort of the school side or the institutional side. School equipment management. So this is this cross between, the social, scientific, medical side of bullying and how to try to prevent that, crossing over into the information technology side. And might have seen a lot of news articles about GoGuardian in terms of how much they can control the technology, how they're able to activate webcams at whim, for instance, or track where each piece of technology is at any time. Also reading anything that's typed. So it doesn't even need to be sent out in an email, right? So some of these technologies are going to be able to track every single word that a kid types, even if they delete it later, and then flag those. A lot of concerns about privacy with these, and then it's that compromise between the ability to have some freedom and engage and do some of the learning, especially for young people, to learn the limits of behaviors, while also making sure to create a safe environment. One of the big things about technological interventions, for instance, would be like how to secure equipment, and that's a big one, right? So a common thing would be for a bully to take another kid's smartphone, another kid's laptop that they logged in on, and then they haven't logged out or locked it, and then being able to send scandalous things under someone else. So really attempting to lock down and make sure that technology is only used by the person we want them to. Workplaces are pretty good at this. That's why we have what is the bane of many existences, which is two-factor authentication. You got to put in a password, and then have another separate sign-on. But it's been demonstrated to really secure the technology and prevent nefarious use. And next slide, please. So while these technological tools are great, we do have some concerns. So for instance, the majority of schools that utilize any kind of equipment control schema have some kind of monitoring of what is being posted and what is being typed out on their systems. So whether they're using Google Classroom or Zoom and using the chat function there, all that stuff tends to be routed through the servers of the vendors that the schools have subscribed to. So if someone on a Google Doc is typing out, I want to kill so-and-so, or I'm really thinking about suicide, that will be flagged. And then depending on the severity based off of whichever algorithm that company is using, we'll have a different set of flags, and then they'll be forwarded on to the IT professional monitoring that system. One of the big issues research has found out is that there's actually, diversity, equity, inclusion concerns regarding this kind of technology use. The lower your socioeconomic status, the more likely you're going to be using school administered equipment. And then the higher the socioeconomic status, the rate of school equipment being used goes down significantly. They just prefer to use their own products, like their own phone and their own laptop. What this often translates to is that then these young people of higher SES, especially at the same school, will be able to say and do things online or like in school events that wouldn't get flagged, versus kids lower on the SES would then be using just the school equipment and anything they say. So more opportunities essentially to get flagged and get in trouble for, which then perpetuates this cycle. Another thing that's been coming up as English language learners. So there's turns of phrases that often don't translate well and often result in young people getting in trouble just because they did a literal translation. So the example I often bring up is Korean. So I'm Korean American, and then if anyone watches Korean dramas, the subtitles aren't always accurate, but a really common thing would be, 죽고 싶어, or like 죽을래, which is like, do you want to die? And the way it often translates in Korean dramas in the subtitles is, are you kidding me? Or like, really? You're going to do that? So, and which is the accurate translation for the context. On the other hand, if a kid who's in ESL is just remarking on a comment and they literally translate the Korean in their head to the English in their head, then it translates to, do you want to die? And then that context often is really important, but it gets lost when you do that translation, especially if you're not comfortable with that other language. And that's been found to obviously like flag the systems and then have kids get in trouble, even though there's no ill intent behind it. And another area where we have a lot of issues is then who is the one that is fielding these inputs that the vendors are sending out. So if a kid says the word suicide is flagged, or kill is flagged, or abuse is flagged, it tends to go right to the IT professional. So then this is what we call mission creep. So these are people that were hired by school systems or institutions in order to keep the equipment safe, monitor it, and just make sure it's running well. And all of a sudden, they're being now pulled into evaluating mental health concerns without any training. Couple ways around that, and this is very much a work in progress, is like, do we give the IT professionals more mental health training, or then do we start pulling in mental health professionals to assist with the IT side of things? And cost money, so obviously it's not something that's easy to fix. Next slide, please. So some of the upcoming potential technologies to use to address bullying are actually really interesting, and again goes into that balance between how much surveillance is worth it versus like freedom and the ability to learn within the context of a school system. Context-aware computing is sort of this brand new frontier where increasing numbers of researchers are finding that if you can use your cell phone, or in a more recent case was using just hanging name tags, and it has an accelerometer in it, which detects movement and motion, and it was able to detect bullying acts in real time. So it is able to identify someone just walking through the hallway or tripping and falling over a curb versus someone being pushed to trip and fall over a curb. So the accelerometer is sensitive enough, and then the changes in movement, which seems pretty obvious. So if you tripped over a curb versus you were pushed and then you tripped over a curb, you know that that sensation is different. And it turns out that technology now can actually pick that up as well and send out an alert in real time. So one of the hypothetical examples is, right, a kid in the hallway gets like pushed into a locker. That context-aware computing system then alerts the school system, which then points a camera and records the event, right? You know, the first 10 minutes prior to that event is now being recorded, and then onwards. So that's one way to then essentially try to prevent that behavior from happening by increasing accountability. But also, right, sort of a scary kind of big brother thing. Biometric tracking is something that's actually currently being used. So not quite super state of the art, but sort of increasing um, what we're able to see and where people are, what they're doing, right? So if they're checked into a classroom, for instance, and they're logged onto a computer, we know exactly where they are. And then making sure that you're targeting the right person for the intervention, especially when it comes to like uses of technology that's shared between people, so classroom computers, for instance. And then we have what are called serious games or applied games. And this actually is going back to that idea of empathy, or someone that's unwilling to be identified as a bully or being bullied. So serious games essentially use the same mechanics as a current game. So it could be any of a blockbuster game right now, but the point of it, rather than being entertainment, is to teach something. And there's actually a lot of evidence that serious games are impactful, actually not just in bullying and teaching young people things, but also um, exercises for other diseases to include dementia and things like that. But the sort of the idea is like a kid doesn't want to say that, oh, I'm a bully or I'm being bullied. But then, you know, if you're playing as a superhero and then you're placed into a position that you don't necessarily want, right? Like getting captured or having something happen to you within the game, it actually builds that empathy if it's designed towards that point. So that I think is pretty useful, especially moving forward, given that kids love games. And sort of a big thing that's occurring currently and taking advantage of these technologies would be to address friction points, mentioned on a previous slide. So friction points are these identified locations where bullying may happen and can happen at a higher rate. So it's usually going to be where there's many people and decreased accountability. So less supervision, like per the number of people. So lunch lines, passing periods, assemblies, and things like that. So increasing awareness of like that these are locations where things can happen, and then using technologies to try to prevent that. A stereotypical example for that would be the lunch line, for instance. If a kid's going there to purchase lunch, and then they're just like, bully behind them is just like, oh, that's cool. You have some money. So why don't you give me the money? And so we have some schools that are going to a cashless system. So no cash, and you can't use a card or anything like that. It really is their thumbprint is tied to their account for lunch. So trying to eliminate any point where someone can be asking for money or for something to be purchased for them. You got to put your thumbprint on at the end where you're being supervised. And then if you're like, why are you paying for 2 lunch trays, right? That can't happen because someone's supposed to be watching out for that at the end of the line. So something that's actually currently happening in a lot of elementary schools. And then next slide, please. So, and that's a lot of the technology stuff. When we talk about pharmacological interventions for bullying, there is nothing specifically for bullying. really it's taking a look at what are sort of the underlying possible disease processes and then addressing those. And then once you address those, along with therapy, right, then we would expect the ability to remain resilient in the face of bullying or to address that situation, or for bullies being less likely to need to bully in order to gain some kind of relief. ADHD is one of the most common ones, as mentioned earlier. Also, one of the ones that tends to be missed pretty easily, especially in females. So young men tend to be more externalizing, so they have those disruptive behaviors that are flagged earlier, versus young ladies who have ADHD often are not as externalizing, whether it's a combination of just female versus male development versus societal expectations, but females are underdiagnosed, and all the data is pointing to underdiagnosed and undertreating this condition leads to increasing victimization. Across the board, regardless of sort of the underlying diagnoses, right, that are being evaluated, psychotherapy is the preferred intervention. Don't really want to toss chemicals into kids unless we gotta. ADHD is one of those, over the past 40 years has gone a lot of back and forth. Like, is this something where behavioral interventions matter, or is this very specifically a neurodevelopmental disorder where medicines are the primary player? I think the evidence is increasingly clear that there is a therapeutic role, right, for ADHD. Those behavioral interventions do help a lot. And then if there's a limit to those behavioral interventions, right, then medications definitely do help. But in the end, a lot of it comes down to identifying that these externalizing behaviors are a result of something internally that is not going well, and then attempting to diagnose that appropriately. And then for bullying victims, just acknowledging that that entire process of living that experience can often lead to impact either at that moment or down the line, and it would be good to effectively screen that. And very often, even if they don't want to, because they want to think that everything is fine. And I think that's it from my end.
Thank you, Dr. Yang and Dr. Miles. So we are now at the Q&A portion of our webinar. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button on the Zoom taskbar below. We will try to answer as many questions as we can in the time we have left, and we do have a good amount of time left. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to put those in the Zoom task, the Q&A portion on the Zoom taskbar below. I just want to mention, though, that if we don't get to your question, you can always send an email message after the webinar at rogersbh.org. So it's webinars at rogersbh.org. Again, webinars at rogersbh.org. That's the email you can send your questions to, and we will follow up with you. So, I do have some questions here that are coming in. One question that I have is for either Dr. Miles or Dr. Yang. How can professionals guide parents to maintain current knowledge of any jargon that young people are using to know whether it is concerning?
I can take that one.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So it changes very frequently. And there's a couple of resources available. Surprisingly, actually, Wikipedia is actually quite on top of things, but more frequently than not, local news organizations tend to pick up on these things really well, as well as tech-focused journalism. So any parts of the larger newspapers often tend to focus on these things as they are occurring, or especially as papers are put out. So it'd be like the New York Times, LA Times, and large papers like that, the Associated Press. One that I often get asked about is Urban Dictionary, and that does get updated very frequently because it's essentially the users as they almost like almost like wanting to claim it. Like I came up with it, want to have the first input, and then they'll update it almost immediately. The big heads up that I often give is that Urban Dictionary is not often child friendly. So you'll get the information that you want, but it might be crude.
The other
Yeah.
place I would recommend is directly from the kids. I mean, it's not been an uncommon situation where a word is used and I don't actually know what exactly it refers to. And I'm not going to necessarily ask them in the middle of like an escalated situation, but with a patient or child and otherwise that I have at least somewhat of a relationship, I'll be like, because they do like it when you're vulnerable. They also like that there's that power difference then of like they know something you don't, and they often will share that with you.
Yep. Ooh, and once they share it with you, I often tell parents to verify it again. So look it up again because their kid actually might totally have it wrong, or like their group of friends is using it incorrectly.
I do see a couple other questions coming in here. One here is there any research that shows merely having nice words printed all over the school, such as like kindness or empathy, does anything like that have anything to do with preventing bullying, or do programs need to start incorporating, that into interventions or curriculum in the schools?
I don't know that there is direct research specific to that. However, I'll say that that tends to fit in with that concept of creating a culture um, in which people can very quickly see what you stand for. You want there to be positivity within the environment. Of course, that wouldn't be something you would do all by itself because that is a great start. But if we don't follow that through with other things, then that's where it stops. So I don't know that the research is out there saying this is for sure an effective piece, but I see that as being just like representation, having pictures of individuals who are different throughout your school, as opposed to only having majority visualization throughout. So I think it falls under that category and certainly wouldn't be something that I would say not to do. Just do it in incorporation with other parts of an intervention.
Yeah, agree with Dr. Miles. The last thing, which is a while ago, has to do with how the military was using it, and I think that the sort of translation in terms of military rights, so they'll have the word honor everywhere, for instance. But as Dr. Miles was saying, that is not just those words up there, right? It's incorporated throughout that entire experience and trying to inculcate that culture. And then the words then emphasize that and keep it sort of at the forefront within that context that it's a focus like throughout that career path.
Yeah. And just also, making sure that the teachers and the adults in the school building are involved in pushing forth those kind of bullying, anti-bullying messages. Do you think that's really important as well?
Absolutely. I mean, that goes along with this culture. If the adults in that room, in the school, in the classroom are not on board with the idea of anti-bullying and what that all truly entails, then they are not likely going to be very effective. It's just like if someone serves you a meal that you don't really like and you pretend to like it, you're not going to be as excited about it, or it's not going to be as noticeable as if you actually genuinely have excitement and are interested and want it to go forward.
Thank you. We've got another question here. Should therapists be providing empathy training to clients, or should we leave that to the schools? And if so, could you provide some resources for empathy training?
I'm going to
Yeah.
say absolutely. It should be done if an individual seems like that's an area that they really need, absolutely providing that as an intervention with clients as well as within the schools. That's not something that I think can be overdone. As far as resources are concerned, I don't have a direct resource of like, this is a particular program, but I do know that the research talked a lot about, especially young children, and I think you can age this up in different ways, is having stories that are about different characters and stopping through those stories and talking through like, well, how do you think this person felt in this situation? And what would you do? What would you think about that? How would you feel? And being able to kind of connect it to the individual and their personal experience.
Great. Thank you for that. And then I've got another one here. So as you mentioned earlier in the webinar, goals of kids which are leading to bullying can be like inappropriate goals, but how exactly do you get a child to change their goals?
That's a good question. So I think you start with exploring what is that goal and where did it come from? Sometimes they're not going to necessarily know that answer themselves, and you may have to do some more digging with the family members, the caregivers around them, even the school. Pulling together the observations that other people have of the kid may help you in forming that conceptualization of where that may have come from. And then that might give you a better jumping off point with the child to talk about, like, it seems really important to you that, and fill in whatever goal you're noticing. And then even giving them some evidence as to why that might make sense that it's really important to them. So a sense of value and importance through bullying for popularity might actually make a lot of sense for a kid who lives, just for example, in a home of many people. So they've maybe got multiple parents there. They may have multiple siblings there, as well as other family members, and their sense of importance is really small. And so that might be another direction to go, is to look at like, where can we find your sense of importance within the family, but also within the school that's different than needing to be the most popular person. So sometimes just really diving in and digging into the actual the details of what's going on. Sometimes the kid can't give you that directly, and you got to pull from other areas to figure all that out.
Yeah, this next question is kind of similar to what we were just discussing here. We have someone who said, like, when working with someone, this child was saying that they have to bully because this particular kiddo they consider to be a bully, and they feel like they're protecting other students. Is there any interventions or anything that you could recommend to help in this situation?
I mean, it's right, they're indicating sort of a positive reason for doing something that is going to have any negative impact on them. So it's sort of encouraging and empathizing with that desire to be helpful, and then redirecting that into a more productive manner. So, and really depends on the age as well, right? So for older kids, like late teens and things like that, oftentimes they'll respond well to analogies towards adulthood. So it's like, oh, you're going to be an adult in 2 years, for instance, or you're going to be an adult next year. How does this translate if it happens in your workplace, right? And then they're like, oh, well, there's like police for that, for instance, right? So the ability to identify roles, right, and sort of limitations of where they're at and how they can utilize institutions more effectively, for instance.
That's actually not an uncommon experience, and the research does talk about that. They're considered bully victims, where they become a victim and then they become a bully as a result of that victim experience, and that can be for a variety of different reasons. So with those younger kids too, it really still goes back to that same building empathy building rather, and giving them some other resources. Because if they are feeling like they maybe tried some of these resources and they have failed, so now they're going to take it in their own hands, we need to explore that too. Are the options that they have to help them not effective? And then what do we need to do about that?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's some really great points. We do have some more questions here. Wondering if you could give an example of a reward system that could be used.
So a really, I was going to say easy, but that's subjective. An option that I've seen happen is kind of a caught you being good. And so it's really not uncommon that our youth will get caught up in these cycles of doing these negative things. And some of them we struggle with, and like, let's own that. It's hard to find the good that they're doing. But the moment you find one small thing, reinforcing and rewarding that, so even if it's just through praise or whatever, hopefully that child will respond pretty positively to, and you start to flip that script of they start doing the things that are more positive because they're going to get more response to that. It might even simply be attention. So they're doing these negative behaviors, they get attention for it because someone needs to intervene. One of the techniques within PCIT training really does focus on that, keeping in mind safety, of course, but when someone is a victim of someone picking on them, the response is to respond to the victim and not the aggressor first, at least, to provide that positive attention towards the victim more so than the aggressor. And eventually you may need to address that aggressor differently, but you're going to do it hopefully in a way that doesn't provide a ton of reinforcement for the behavior that they had. And you can even set up some basic reward systems very specific to I have a goal for you to do this kind thing for this person once a day. You do that, you get a sticker. You get so many stickers, you get whichever reward you've agreed upon would be most motivating for them. So you can really set up a system to try and push that pro-social behavior.
Thank you for that, Dr. Miles. That's very helpful. Here's another question that's I think is kind of interesting. So what strategies would you suggest when a psychologist is working with a family to manage bullying and the family advocates aggression as a problem-solving strategy?
So this sort of comes back to like what is initially driving a lot of what's happening with regard to the behaviors, and essentially it's going to be guiding sort of towards so often when families are advising aggression as a response, we're talking about trying to fix a single problem, right? Or the next time this one thing happens, like do this next thing, rather than sort of a more nuanced, like what is causing that in the first place? What are other opportunities to utilize institutions in place, as well as skills and strategies, right, to avoid. So generally speaking, we don't want to encourage any use of aggression. And then it also comes down to like, how has the family responded previously in the past? Like, is this a common pattern within the family? Just because like maybe the parent was bullied or was a bully in the past, and then this is how they learned to then respond to that, whether effectively or ineffectively. Most of the time it's going to be ineffective, or it's going to lead to consequences that they might not even be aware of. So really involving the family to try to come up with additional solutions despite, right, the parental experience that sort of guides their guidance for their kid.
Thank you, Dr. Yang. So this question goes back to, we mentioned during the presentation that kids diagnosed with ADHD are at higher risk. And so are there interventions that all clinicians who work with this group of kids could incorporate into their sessions as a proactive measure?
Yeah, so even without ADHD as a diagnosis, one of the hallmarks of undeveloped brains, which is every single young person, right, is impulsivity. So it would be essentially practicing how to like decrease impulsivity, as well as increasing the number of options available, even when a decision is being made very emotionally, right? So working through scenarios, it's always difficult. Even if you know the information, a pop quiz is always more difficult than a quiz that you know that is coming up. And working with sort of like, what would you do in this situation, like these hypotheticals, actually then is almost like preparing for a future situation. It's always easier to have gone through a couple options in your head for a potential situation that might come up than it is to try to think on the fly. Yeah.
I think one of the other things that came out in the research is that there's a level of social deficits that are within the ADHD individual. And sometimes that's a matter of like their behaviors might be pushing their peers away. And if they're pushing their peers away, then they're less likely to learn from their peers or have a safe peer group in which to engage in some of these behaviors and then learn that like, oh, that's annoying to people. I shouldn't do that. And so doing a little more exploring, potentially in a group setting if possible, of like what do their social interactions actually look like and what areas are of most deficit, and then build upon those as opposed to maybe doing things they're already pretty good at or know about.
Sure. Thank you for that. How do we as clinicians encourage school connectedness when school is the place where the bullying takes place?
I think that's going to be a really important look at, like, again, what is happening with the bullying? Where is it occurring within the school? Why is it occurring? Taking a deeper look at both the bully and their situation as well as the victim. And then trying to find the areas of interest. What I have seen for the most part, and I realize this is not necessarily globally true, is that a lot of schools have done a pretty good job of finding a variety of a wide variety of options for kids to engage in. So it's not all just sports. So if you're not into sports, then you don't have anything to look at or to try out. And they've really, I think, done a nicer job, but the kids don't always know what those options all are or what they mean as far as, is this even something I would like? Is it of interest to me? And so looking at those different resources for the kids to engage them into the school and connect them in a way where they can take their focus off of being negative towards peers and more onto these other areas and develop some different skills.
Yeah, and I think the question often comes up because parents are worried that their kids are just not going to like school or learning in general because of the situation. And oftentimes this is when we try to actually disconnect the idea that school is only learning and learning only happens in school. So it'd be incentivizing sort of academic work outside, remaining interested. Like you don't have to do really well in your math class at school to say that I like math, right? So then providing additional opportunities to do academic activities outside of the school context and then being rewarded and incentivized for that. So saying like learning is something that you just do and enjoy and you're good at, and we'll continue to encourage it, and not saying I don't like learning because I don't like school because I'm being bullied. So trying to disconnect that.
Thank you. We got another question in here. So what are the resources specific to building protective factors for LGBTQ youth?
The biggest protective factor is going to be creating that sense of environment where they are accepted, where they don't have to come in and pretend to be something that they know they aren't, just to protect themselves from, to keep themselves safe, really. And I think that starts at the youngest age and hopefully goes up through all of the grades. So all the way into kindergarten, again, allowing people to be able to be who they are, and acceptance for that, no judgment and not extra questions. That's the other thing that often comes up. Like, why would you ask someone, why would you ask one person what their pronouns are, but not another person? So making that a consistent experience. We're going to go around, we're going to say our name, and we're going to say what our pronouns are, rather than making it oh, that person looks different. What pronouns do you want? And you think you're being kind because you want to use the correct pronouns, but in reality, you're kind of calling them out in front of everybody. And so thinking about things that way, also having safe space. So we know that not every school is going to have all kids who are accepting and wonderful, and but having a very safe space they can go to where they can talk about the things that they're struggling with. They can be who they are without worry about judgment, and making sure the kids know that they have that option.
Sometimes these questions come up in states or localities that are actively trying to limit their resources available for help. And that can be sort of troublesome because then it goes sort of against the grain, is pointing out that no, you are different and we don't want to offer you the same protections and things like that. And that is really difficult to manage. And usually the recommendation, depending on the age as well, would be sort of this idea of, taking it greater than yourself, right? So normalizing them within the context. So if the local community has a lot of rules in place that prevents them from being themselves, right? Almost promote taking a look like at a greater level, like the state, the country as a whole. What are other people doing in order to help, make people similar to you, like more accepted, right? And yeah, it and just having that view, right? That world that you're in right now is not great, but there are actions that you can take, right? Giving a little bit of agency as well. Maybe not at that moment, but in the future.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Yang and Dr. Miles. This is a really good one coming in here. So what specific distress tolerance strategies do you recommend for elementary school aged kids and also middle schoolers?
So I would say to start with teaching some coping skills that they can use when they're feeling distress, but also giving opportunity to talk directly about the fact that sometimes we're going to feel this way. Sometimes our emotions are going to be really, really big and they're going to be difficult to deal with. It's going to make us want to run away. It's going to make us want to fight. It's going to make us want to do all kinds of things that we might actually get in trouble for. And the really cool thing is that if we sit with that emotion and we don't do anything with it, but we just sit there, it's actually going to get better. It might not feel like it's going to, but it will. But in relation to that, we're going to want to give them some coping skills so that when it's not feeling like it's going to feel better, they can engage in those kinds of skills to help them. So some of those might be distraction skills, finding something that they can do that is going to take their mind away from the strong emotions that they're having, at least for right now. And when they can come back to it, they're either in a safe place to really deal with that, or they're just less in strength and intensity anyway. And then thinking about those distractions in relation to different environments. And so that's come up often for me of like, I can't just read a book in the middle of math class because I'm supposed to be working on math. So what are some other options that I can do that other people might not notice, but they still help me? Sometimes it's excuse me, a fidget. Sometimes it's a matter of focusing on my breathing. Sometimes it's a matter of some simple mindfulness skills that will draw my attention back to where it needs to be rather than this big emotion. And reminding the child that, or setting them up if they don't already have it, that they have a place that they can go to actually work on dealing with those things. And that distress does not mean that it has to be the end of everything, that we all are going to go through these challenges and we're here as the adults to support you with it too. But you also got to let us know when that's happening.
And then the therapy portion as well, right? So if the distress results in significant physical symptoms, right? So that lightheadedness, that kind of dissociation, right? Panic attacks, oftentimes like we'll often practice like interoceptives, right? So having them hyperventilate to get some of that feeling, but then realizing that that is a feeling that they can overcome. So practicing those individual, like physical portions that might be overwhelming in the moment, but then becoming used to understanding that that's not the end of things, that you can develop a skill that despite the fact that you feel out of control, that you can increase your control.
Thank you. Here's another question here, and we've only got time for a couple more. So what steps would you recommend when an adolescent patient is experiencing physical bullying at school and the school has failed to intervene with this type of bullying as it appears to be part of the culture?
That's often really difficult. But physical danger, things like that, is often going to require then escalation within that system. So all school systems have a system of escalation, whether it goes to the local superintendent of the district, but also escalates towards the State Department of Education, and often is going to be engaging the State Department of Education's ombudsman to say that this is an issue that's occurring. And then very often it's going to be maintaining that kind of documentation of like all the conversations, essentially because you're talking about changing the way an institution is running because they're not fulfilling their duties, and that requires evidence over time, unfortunately. But it's, if you have a talk with a principal, right, it's often recommended follow up that talk with an email covering exactly what was talked about, right, sent to that principal, so that when the state does need to intervene, if they have to, right, then there's evidence supporting, the conversations that have already taken place.
Thank you, Dr. Yang. Well, we are getting to the end of our time here. So I just want to remind everyone, if we did not get to your question, you can still feel free to send an email to webinars@rogersbh.org, and we will follow up with you. Please note that the recording of this program will be published on Rogers' YouTube channel in a few days, so you can go back and you can watch it again. You can share it with your colleagues. Before we conclude, I'd like to ask our presenters to share a few key takeaways on this topic. Dr.
I would
Yang?
like to, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Dr. Yang, Dr. Miles.
Okay. So I guess I want to start by pointing out that bullying is still an issue and we do need to continue working on it. The part of the reason why I point that out is sometimes I feel like this topic is considered overdone because it's talked about a lot, but I don't know that we always do more than just talk about it. So it's really important because the consequences can truly be serious for the victims in the bullying experience and for the bullies too. And again, remember, we're working to find that root cause of what the bullying behavior is and addressing that to help address the actual behavior. That's not always easy, but it is really important in making sure that we make substantial change. And then finally, creating a culture within the home, the school and or work environment that promotes anti-bullying values, inclusivity, and acceptance of others. That's going to be key in changing the current bullying situation.
So if a school comes up super proud of their new anti-bullying technology, that is not a root cause, right? That's still a Band-Aid. That's something that can help out, but they can be a little less proud because we're wanting to work on the, the culture and the root causes.
Thank you. So that about wraps it up, everyone. I just want to remind all of our participants that within the next 30 minutes, you will receive an email with a link to your personal dashboard on CE-Go, where you will be able to access PDFs of the PowerPoint slide as a handout, the SORT assessment measure, and a complete list of all the references. So that's all coming to you. Those of you who meet the required time commitment will be eligible for CE credits. We will also use that link to complete the evaluation and download to your CE, and you'll be able to download your CE certificate. So if you have any questions about this follow-up email, please contact support@ce-go.com. Our outreach representatives are looking forward to connecting with you. So those on my team, we love to connect with you, learn more about your practice, help to understand all the different treatment options that are here and available at Rogers for your patients and your clients. And I just like to say, on behalf of everyone at Rogers, we look forward to partnering with you to help support your patients. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you all for being here.
Everybody.